We have two excellent speakers today to introduce the topic and to divine some of the issues regarding this very complex issue and topic. The first speaker today will be Dr. Orin Bolstad, who is Executive Director of the Morrison Center for Youth and Family Services. He is a psychologist who has been with the Morrison Center since 1977, where he has been in charge of a variety of different programs. He was named Executive Director in April of 1987. He has a wide range of research that he has published, and it will be the basis for his talk today. In addition to his work at Morrison Center, he also holds an appointment as a clinical associate. You know, they give you this job, but they never test to see whether or not you can actually speak, thank goodness. Clinical Associate Professor at the Oregon Health Sciences Center, the thing on the hill where they take care of sick people. My apologies, Dr. Bolstad. I'm in communications and it shows. Dr. Bolstad will describe the results of his research on risk factors in regard to children in Portland, and his staff will be at the back of the room at the end of his session, our session today, with extra copies if you'd like to read in more detail some of the background and the research that he has just concluded. That research is entitled 2,500 Families. Our second speaker today will be Alcena E, who is Assistant Director of Alternative Education for Portland Public Schools. She has a diverse background as a teacher, counselor, administrative vice principal, and coordinator of student discipline programs for Portland Public Schools. She also serves as an ordained Episcopal priest, and she is serving the Diocese of Oregon. This is my day, I can tell you. I apologize to both of our speakers for my inarticulateness. She has promised me that there will be no passing of a plate at the end of her speech. However, she says donations are certainly welcome. A message, by the way, which goes equally well for the City Club. Ms. Boozer will discuss the reality of young people who have moved beyond the risk factors using a case study to illustrate how to move beyond statistics and outlining some of the many programs which are offered in our community dealing with children at risk. Will you help me welcome our program today, Dr. Orin Bolstad and Alcena Boozer.
A good friend of mine, David Fuchs, who is the head of the Juvenile Services Commission, was telling me about some of his experiences as a camp counselor at a summer camp in Michigan a number of years ago. One story that he told me seems especially apropos for our topic. One day at camp, David was leaving to pick up supplies. A particularly precocious young boy of about 6 years approached him and asked him if he was going to town. David allowed as how he was. The boy then casually said to David, "While you're there, would you mind stopping at the liquor store?" "I beg your pardon," David said. "Yeah," the kid said, I want a fifth of bourbon." "Son," said David, "how old are you?" "I'm 6, said the boy. Still puzzled, David further inquired, "You're 6 and you drink?" "Sure," said the boy, "I've been drinking for years." Stunned, David said, "Next thing you're going to tell me is that you've had sex." "Sure," the boy replied nonchalantly. Still incredulous, David's curiosity piqued with this last comment, and he said, "Tell me, what was it like?" The boy replied, "Can't remember, I was drunk." I think this story has shock value, and there lies its humor. 6-year-old boys are not supposed to be drinking liquor, much less having sex. We see these activities as taboo for young people. But in our program for addicted adolescents at the Morrison Center, it's not uncommon to learn that serious drug abuse began as early as 6 or 7 years of age. That makes this camp story not quite so implausible. In the Morrison Center study of 2,500 families, we found that the average age for children to begin using marijuana was 10 years and 4 months. Recently, a survey was completed here in Oregon on 8th graders in public schools. From this study, we learned that 1 out of 8 8th graders report using marijuana within the last month. 4% report using cocaine within the last month. Nearly 2% of all 8th graders in Oregon reported using cocaine on a daily basis. I want you to stop and think about that for a second. That translates as about 700 8th graders in Oregon that are using cocaine on a daily basis. The number of babies being born with serious addictions in Portland is truly remarkable. I want to share with you a preliminary finding I just heard this last week based on the first 6 months of this year of 1989. 6 children here in Oregon died due to prenatal drug abuse by their mothers. These babies ranged in age from 5 days to 2.5 years. I heard that the 2.5-year-old was in absolute agony from the day he was born until he died at 2.5 years. Apparently his parents both also died of drug overdose. That only sounds like 6, right? But let me share with you another finding from the Best-Kaiser study that was recently issued. During pregnancy, 11.2% of all the mothers in the Kaiser system tested positive for addictive drug abuse. Now that's excluding alcohol and it's excluding cigarettes. So the addictive drug use that we're talking about is marijuana, cocaine, and other drugs. Child abuse is another area that yields shocking statistics. In 1987, there were over 15,000 cases of confirmed child abuse here in Oregon. 23 children died from child abuse, and 10 of these were 24 months or younger. Nearly 4,000 children were reported as victims of child sexual abuse. Of this 4,000 figure, 27% were 5 years or younger. Research in our agency here in Portland, as well as national research, demonstrates that abuse in childhood correlates with juvenile delinquency, drug and alcohol abuse, mental and emotional problems, and school failure. I trust that most of you will not be shocked to hear that about 25% of all the students who enroll in high school drop out before they graduate. This finding has been much publicized. You may not be aware that another 5 to 10% never even make it into these statistics because they never enroll in high school in the first place. Think of it, 3 out of 10 of every students do not finish with a high school degree. In a national test of 17-year-olds, 1 in 7 was found to be incapable of performing even rudimentary math problems and couldn't read above the 3rd grade level. A very recent survey by the Educational Testing Service compared math and science scores among 13-year-olds representing 5 different countries. Using identical sampling methods in each country, the results obtained were striking. The United States was in the last place in math and nearly the last place in science. Korea was in first place both for math and for science. Interestingly, they did attitude questions in this survey also. They asked kids, do you think you're good in math? 68% of the American kids thought they were good in math. Only 23% of the Koreans thought they were good in math. But now I'm probably adversely affecting your digestion. So I will limit myself to just one other piece of bad news about children that I find particularly distressing, and I'm sure you do too. I know that most of you are concerned about crime here in Portland. Did you know that nearly 50% of all crime is committed by juveniles? Juveniles under the age of 18. Now you might say, well, some of those crimes aren't serious crimes. Okay. There is a way of gauging serious crimes. It's called using the index crimes, reported by the Uniform Crime Index Survey of the Census Bureau. What we know here in Oregon is that 31% of all the serious crimes in Oregon, that's like murder, rape, assault, there's 8 of them, very serious crimes, 31% of the most serious crimes in Oregon were committed by juveniles under the age of 18. These kinds of statistics have been alarming to many of us who work with children. We sometimes have wondered if anyone else is noticing. So I was quite encouraged couple of years ago when a national report was issued by the President's Commission on Economic Development. This report was put together by corporate business leaders and chaired by Owen Butler, the retired chairman of Procter & Gamble. Butler and his committee became convinced that this country is on the brink of losing its competitive position in the world marketplace. They were especially concerned about the declining status of our workforce. 1 million children drop out of school every year. By and large, they drop into welfare, crime, and dependency on the state. The committee projects that next year there will be a shortage of over 23 million Americans willing and able to work. We already are beginning to import labor from other countries. By the year 2000, Butler projects that we will be importing over 30 million workers from other countries who have technical skills that we can't find here in America. And that's going to come with a huge cost. Butler cautions that we're running out of time. Fortunately, there is encouraging news. We do have the technology to make a difference. If we are wise, and if we intervene early enough in the lives of disadvantaged children, we can reverse these alarming trends. One example was cited by Butler in his report. It's an example of the Perry Preschool project in Ypsilanti, Michigan. Now, this preschool project is especially interesting because they did a 20-year follow-up on the kids who graduated from that program. They also had a comparison group, a control group of kids who didn't go through that program, but who also were followed for 20 years. Most of the children in this program were poor, low-income, black children between the ages of 3 and 5. The results from this study are striking. Children who went through this program were less than half as likely to drop out of school, to become criminally involved, to experience teen pregnancy, and to need remedial education. Even more encouraging was the cost savings. Those children who did not attend the preschool incurred 6 times the costs in social and educational services compared with the other group that did go through it by the age of 25. So for every dollar spent in preschool programs, $6 were saved in later costs. Another development that I find encouraging is the surge of new knowledge coming from longitudinal research on children. Children identified at birth and followed for 20 to 25 years. The value of this research is that it helps us figure out which children are most likely to end up with serious mental illness or criminality or other problems such as drug addiction. If we know who these children are at a very young age, we have a much better chance to turn them around. The longer we wait, the harder it is to reverse patterns that become entrenched. In the area of mental illness, for instance, we have identified 6 risk factors which greatly enhance our ability to predict mental illness. I'll not detail those here today. They're available in the document that we have for you on the way out. Some of the factors include things like having a mother who's mentally ill, poverty, large family size, etc. We also have 9 factors that allow us to predict criminality, allow us to know at a very young age, especially at the age of first crime, who will become career criminals. Some of these factors include things like having a father who had a history of criminality, harsh and erratic discipline, behavior and academic problems in the first couple of grades, those kinds of factors. We also have factors that predict serious addiction. Unfortunately, we are not identifying these children early enough in our existing systems here in Oregon. We wait until they cause serious problems and can no longer be avoided. Unfortunately, by then, oftentimes it's too late. Police officers daily encounter children under the age of 12 committing very serious crimes. They are frustrated because they know these kids won't receive services until they're 15 or 16. For instance, there are no services for 10 to 11-year-old kids, boys, who are committing very serious sex offending crimes in this community. We know that this kind of problem is going to get worse as these kids get older. But we have no resources for that kind of population. Interestingly, there's a group of children that we're beginning to learn a great deal from. These are the children that we predict are going to show some of these serious problems, like criminality, mental illness, addiction. And these kids turn out to defy the odds. They don't show these factors at all. They are what we describe resilient to the risk status that they have. Now, our attitude when we first came up with these kinds of kids was we felt frustrated because we missed our prediction. We said they were going to be mentally ill or criminal, and they weren't. It took us a while to realize that we were sitting on a gold mine. The kids who defy the odds and turn out to be okay in spite of their risk status are intriguing. We've begun studying them and trying to figure out what characterized these youngsters so that they weren't turning out to be having serious problems. You know, if we can really figure out how these resilient kids pull this off, we can package that as a major preventive strategy here in Oregon. Now, there is some recent research in this area, and it's generating some positive results. We're learning that resilient children appear to be characterized by things like having a positive temperament, seeing the cup half full instead of half empty, by good problem-solving skills. And they also tend to have parents who are warm but consistent in their discipline, and also parents who themselves have good parenting and problem-solving skills. Taken together, the emerging research on risk and resilience give us hope. We know that we must intervene earlier in these children's lives. We need to directly attack those risk factors that we can change. And we need to promote those factors which make children resilient. In sum, we know what works. We know how to intervene. We know who to intervene with. We know when to intervene. We even know what the costs are if we intervene, and we know what the costs are if we don't. We don't lack for knowledge, although more knowledge is always welcome. We lack will. We lack the will to make a long-term commitment. I'm amazed at the extent to which a short-term commitment seems to rule in most of our lives. By short-term, for politicians, I typically mean between now and the next election. Until we can get past the next election and think in a longer term, this problem is going to continue to haunt us. We lack resources. Be aware that other states and communities have made major investments in high-risk children and in families, and they're already seeing dividends. The state of Washington, for instance, has before the voters in November Initiative 102. This is probably the boldest and most comprehensive plan for children, dealing with high-risk children, that I've seen. Initiative 102 calls for a 1-cent sales tax increase. It will generate $720 million and will provide appropriate child care, parent education, and a host of other critically needed services. It'll be interesting to watch to see how that initiative goes in November. In Oregon, we are making some progress in developing strategies for high-risk children. The Fred Meyer Charitable Trust has devoted a major funding category to children at risk. The State Mental Health Division and the Department of Education have sponsored several creative demonstration projects. We continue to accumulate new knowledge, but a lot of this knowledge ends up just being put on the shelf. In my estimate, we're losing ground every day. We have not made the kind of commitment necessary to address the problems I've described today. It is more than a problem of will. It is also a problem of wallet. High-risk children are going to cost money. You can't duck from that reality. Volunteers will not solve this problem. Spending $50 to $100 a month to buy security systems to protect our personal property won't solve this problem either. The problem is much more fundamental than that. We have to solve this problem not as individuals, but as neighbors in our community. I once witnessed a touching example of this kind of definition of community in the Middle East. My wife and I were standing in line at a bank, and a British woman was in front of us, and she was holding a baby that began to cry. And this baby gradually started crying louder and louder. The bank came to a complete standstill. All the people waiting in line looked at this baby and at this mother. The tellers, everyone was observing this baby. Finally, a teller came out from behind her station and reached gently toward the baby, picked the baby up, and walked the baby around. The baby gradually quit crying. The mother was escorted to the front of the line. That bank stopped because a baby was crying. I think we need to re-examine our sense of community. That baby was of a different color than most of the people in the room. That baby was uncomfortable. There was a sense of community in that group where everyone in that group was concerned about that child, even though that child was a foreigner. We need to expand our definition of community and our definition of neighbor. We need to listen to the cry of children and respond. There are areas in this community of Portland where the cries are fading out, being replaced by hopelessness. Risk factors cluster in neighborhoods of poverty. All you need to do is drive through northeast Portland. Drive through Lentz. Take a look. The poverty that exists in those communities is profound. The risk factors that attach to those communities are profound. We can't let that happen. These are our neighbors. They're part of our community. I urge you to be members of the community at large, to love and care for your neighbors as you care for yourselves. Be thankful if your grandchildren or your children are not at risk. But be concerned also about your neighbors. If we ignore children at risk, they will demand our attention later. If we don't act now, it will cost us more than we can ever afford. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bolstad. And now Alcena Boozer.
Thank you very much. You know, clergy are accustomed sometimes to have someone else go and sort of get the congregation ready, and I appreciate your work, Dr. Bolstad, because I really do bring a message that would invite you to move beyond the statistical world of at-risk kids and beyond the predictions and analyses. What I am proposing now, because I know the City Club to be an action-oriented group, is to take you into the real world of children who are no longer at risk. They're beyond the point of risk. Whatever we were concerned about, school failure, dropout, substance abuse, sexual or physical abuse, has already happened. It's a point where I'm sure you will join me in recognizing that we can no longer hide behind the comfortable distance of written words comprising the endless reports and studies. And folks, we can no longer afford to hide behind our checkbooks and give from our abundance a little conscience money. We can no longer avoid them. Who are they? Let's look at one to learn more about them. You see, Seymour is out there on the streets. I've met him. I might meet him again, and you might meet him. The first time that I met Seymour, he was 8 years old. And was I surprised? You see, I had known about him for a long, long time. I'd seen his name posted on the graffiti displays around town. By name, he had a reputation as a very active gang member. He had organized a group of older children who, armed with bats and clubs, regularly shook down the other kids for their lunch money. So when I got the call that Seymour was being referred to us, I expected somebody at least 12 or 14 years of age. And as the person doing the initial intake interview observed, we were looking for a mean, surly gangster, and we were confronted by an adorable 8-year-old kid who looked like butter wouldn't melt in his mouth. The staff at the referring school had known Seymour since he was about 2, when as an unsupervised toddler wandering the streets of North Portland, the older kids would bring him into the building. Well, the staff fed him and attempted to find his parent. Referrals were made to the appropriate agencies, and Seymour was removed from his mother's custody, and she was an abuser, and his grandmother was appointed as a guardian. Now, Grandma was also the guardian for 4 older youngsters who had been abandoned by their parents. And while she expressed the desire to help her grandsons, at 63, she no longer had the energy, will, or resources to administer discipline or offer guidance in any effective or consistent manner. There were few attempts to do anything for Seymour beyond to supply the most basic needs for food and shelter. He was seldom missed, when he disappeared from home for long hours at a time from the day he first learned to get around his neighborhood on his own. And he spent time on the streets of that neighborhood. And the people of the streets, many of them gang members, became Seymour's family. From then, he learned to talk and to become physically aggressive. In the vernacular of the streets, he learned to walk that walk and talk that talk. With gang members as role models, this miniature OG, that means original gangster, quickly learned all the vernacular and the concomitant nonverbal behaviors. The staff at his school referred him to social workers and child development specialists. The referrals talked about violent, aggressive behavior and inappropriate sexual gestures in the classroom. So understandably, the primary grades for Seymour were times of constant conflict with other children and the school staff. Frustrated by the seeming lack of programs to deal with what she rightly perceived as grossly inappropriate behavior, the principal resorted to out-of-school suspension. You know, Seymour learned a lesson there. When he didn't want to be in school, he needed only to act out, and the school would send him home to the streets, where the stories of his negative behavior became a source of entertainment to the members of his street family, the gang. Our young friend was well on his way to becoming a neighborhood legend. It was at this point that the school staff called my office. And I wondered, you know, sometimes they have clergy for a good reason in schools, because all I could do was pray and say, oh Lord, what are we going to do with this child? So I did contact some members of the newly formed Youth Gang Task Force, a consortium of youth-serving agencies, neighborhood activists, central program school administrators, juvenile justice, and law enforcement personnel. And we found an adult male who would work with Seymour for a while. And during the conferences and staffings which were scheduled, his case history documented for us the classic example of the ways that the variety of risk factors we've been talking about interrelated and resulted in the growth and nurturance of a gang member. You see, Seymour received little attention in the home of his grandmother. He'd been abandoned by his mother. And the people of the streets, gang members or children who looked to gang members as role models, offered the companionship he needed and sought. This extended family also conveyed to him a sense of protection. He was somebody there. He was cared for. And perhaps most important to him, they provided a sense of excitement and adventure. Street activities started to fill the void in his life, and they seemed much more fun and exciting than what the school had to offer at that point. Seymour didn't see much that he considered to be fun or exciting in school. It was pretty boring in the principal's office, waiting to be sent home. But what he did glimpse was a lifestyle which superficially presented the excitement and adventure, the money, the status, but realistically puts him at risk of premature death. What Seymour didn't understand, and what not enough of us understand, is that according to statistics, homicide is a leading cause of death among young people 15 to 24, second only to motor vehicle accidents. And for black young men, homicide is a leading cause of death. The risk for Seymour is the tragic early end of life. But the risk for us is that we will tragically lose too many Seymours and maybe Samanthas to the escalating level of violence across the streets and campuses of America. I don't know what the future really holds for Seymour. In part, that will be a function of fate, but I pray that it will be more a function of appropriate intervention and prevention programs now being put in place to reduce the risk factors that make him more likely to become gang involved or continue with school failure. The community is moving toward awareness of the risk posed to society by all the Seymours who didn't see enough in the way of positive life experiences. You know, our very quality of life is in jeopardy if we truly live to the 21st century and the prediction of a 1986 study that only 30% of the black males in the workforce will be gainfully employed comes true. To put in place the continuum of services required to save Seymour, Samantha, and others like them will require a massive, coordinated community effort. Some pieces are on the drawing boards now, but the real test of our collective commitment will come when the bill is presented. You know, we hear a lot of talk about children's agenda, and I think that's good. But sometimes in my head, agendas speak of meetings and talk. I would like us to start thinking about a children's crusade. Crusade speaks of commitment and action. And I invite you to think of ways to involve yourselves in that crusade so that perhaps we will be willing to tax ourselves to pay for the additional resources that kids like Seymour need to provide individual attention and therapy. And then we have to ask ourselves if we will be willing to make the substantial personal commitment. You know, it's fine, and I applaud and encourage all who contribute. But are we ready to present ourselves along with our ideas and our recommendations and our checks? As a community, be it local, national, or global, we've got to commit ourselves to this struggle ahead. Our kids are at risk, and because they are, our very survival as a people and as a nation is also at risk. The opportunities for action available to us are limited only by our imagination and ingenuity. The problems before us sometimes seem frightening and often, in a sense, overwhelming. Yet, as we begin to seriously examine what is happening in terms of the quality of life that will be available to the coming generation, we should discover that our greatest gains sometimes are made under conditions of greatest stress. The school system, and I'm proud to be a part of that system, as an institution primarily responsible for the next generation, is faced with situations creating a stress capable of crumbling the whole structure. We know that. And as staff members, we're beginning to find the cracks and beginning to do the repair work necessary to support the existing structure until a new one which we have been rebuilding all the time, is complete. And the new structure emerges from some of those pilot programs and some of our alternative efforts. And this new structure will look very different. We will have no need for security systems, fences, or armed law enforcement officers. Inside the new structure, young people will be nurtured and affirmed in a way that will make it almost impossible to understand the talk about the youth gangs of the 80s or the at-risk children. Hopefully, the historical record for this turbulent time will indicate that the school and the community initiated, encouraged, and cooperated community-based programs which resulted in the decrease of the numbers of kids like Seymour, and the violence, and the whole category of at risk. You know, we need to be concerned about where we're going to meet Seymour next. On about the turn of the century, it may be in a bank. And I pray that if it is, he will be there as a depositor, a teller, or a loan officer, in lieu of being there to make a withdrawal at the point of the gun. The choice is ours. Together we can do it. if you will join us in this crusade. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Boozer. I don't know that any of us can't be moved when we hear stories of this, and I would urge each of you to take a look at your own commitment. I certainly will after a speech such as that. Now is time for our question period. Questions are reserved to City Club members. We give priority to those of you that have the courage to stand up in front of the microphone and ask an oral question. We do, however, offer the opportunity for written questions, and there should be a form on each of your tables. If you do wish to do a written question, please hold it up after you've written it, and one of the staff members will pick it up and bring it up to us. The privilege of the first question goes to our board host today, Corleen Kraft, who is a member of the board of the City Club.
I agree with Bill that all of us in here must have been touched by the plea that you both made for involvement. If we weren't touched emotionally, there must have been those in the room who were impacted by the staggering economic implications of having to import 30 million workers by the year 2000. You say we have the knowledge, we know who these kids at risk are early on, we know we don't have the economic resources currently to deal with it. You say volunteers aren't enough, and perhaps we lack the will. So I'd like to ask you for some concrete ways, I'd like to ask each of you to respond in some concrete ways that business and community leaders can involve themselves in this task of setting up programs to work with at-risk youth.
Okay. I'd like to start, and I thought nobody would ever ask. That's how I happen to bring along some documents which will help you to do this. We have been working very carefully with the community, and I have brought along a document put out by the school district called the Portland Blueprint Success for Students at Risk. And it has a specific listing of programs and ways that businesses and community leaders can be involved. And I think of others. There are exciting models across the country where businesses have adopted a school. Individuals on a workforce have then gone in from that business to work with the school, because the magic ingredient that we see in terms of programs at work is often a caring adult having regular contact with a kid whose life is otherwise fairly empty. So we have copies of this document there. I invite you to pick them up and consider those ways, and also to make sure I sign you up. We have a little bulletin from the school district that lists the specific ways volunteers can be involved, whether you're tutoring or helping to keep records, being a visitor at a school, and then there's a coupon for you to sign and send in. So I would expect to be happily sitting in our office and going through many of these in a couple of days. So those are some of the ways, Orin.
I agree with what Alcena said, and I would add to that business leaders in the community, in many respects, are in the best position to advocate for children. When I'm in Salem advocating before legislators, their usual response is, well, there's Orin again. We're going to have to hear the same old litany. They expect me to advocate for children because it's my job. But I think what really impresses legislators is when business leaders show a concern about children. When Owen Butler, the chairman of Procter & Gamble, was here speaking in December, it's amazing. I mean, people listen to business leaders. And I think all of you have many opportunities to talk to your legislators. Call them on the phone, write them letters, meet with them. Let them know that you think this problem of children is urgent. And I'd encourage you also to let them know that you want a more than a short-term perspective. You expect your legislators to be looking beyond the next election. In fact, insist on it. Let them know that they're not going to get your support unless they start advocating and being concerned about children.
A shy audience today, but we do have written questions. Why is it that we don't have appropriate sources for 9-year-olds who commit crimes, and what can we do to put them in place?
Interestingly, some of the most serious crimes that are committed by 9-year-olds don't qualify as felony offenses because they're under 12. I've been working with a pilot project here recently of youngsters between the ages of 8 and 12 who are committing serious sexual offenses. We were able to get funding through United Way and through $1,000 here and $1,000 there, and we put together a project for 14 kids. The surprise in that project, by the way, is that we were trying to find kids who we thought were at risk to become sex offenders when this project began. We picked kids who had been sexually abused themselves, boys who had been sexually abused and who showed an inclination toward delinquency. Within a month of having met those kids, we discovered that 8 of the 14 were already actively committing serious sexual offenses. These kids cannot be tried as felons. It's hard to mandate them into treatment. We have some systemic problems we need to look at, but independent of those, there wasn't any money to serve those kids. We need to look at how we fund programs. We need to look at the amount of money that we're putting into programs for older kids and for adults. And we need to find ways of not taking money away from those programs. They're needed. We need to find ways of coming up with new money.
And to that, I would just say amen.
Dennis Cusack, City Club member. This may be a follow-up to, I guess, the last comment that Dr. Bolstad just made, and I guess I'd focus it towards his attention. We're spending a lot of money in the governor's crime program now, particularly tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars, on building prisons, programs that are focused towards the adult offender. I don't know what we're spending for the youth programs, but I suspect that the dollars in terms of a comparative amount is a fraction of that. Can you talk about the priorities that we're dealing with in our budget?
In the governor's crime package, it was called for $106 million to go into the crime package. The lion's share of that was to go to jail space. You might be interested in knowing that about $5 million out of that $106 million was specifically devoted to juveniles. You remember what I said earlier? 31% of all index crimes are committed by juveniles. Almost 50% of all crime is committed by juveniles. $5 million out of $106 million was devoted to children in the governor's crime package. Now, I don't argue with the notion that $106 million should be devoted to a crime package. I'm pleased about it. But I think as taxpayers, you need to be concerned about your investment. It costs more to send someone to jail for a year than it does to send them to Harvard. Quite a bit more. I'd like to see some of that money be devoted to kids who are very certainly going to end up into the criminal system earlier on. I think we can change them then. Judge Robert Thornton, who used to be the Attorney General here in Oregon for about 14 years, wrote an article in the Oregonian not long ago about this. He was concerned about putting all of our money into one basket, jail space. He was concerned that we need to be devoting more of our funds to intervening with youngsters much earlier. As he put it in his article, $47,000 for a jail space for a year doesn't really generate a great outcome. The recidivism rate is very high, but the outcome that we see from studies like the Perry Preschool Project are quite positive. There's hope in that kind of strategy.
Yes, sir.
Leroy Patton, City Club member. If both or either of the speakers could speak to the citywide problem of at-risk youth, not just the black youth or the ones that we're serving now in the system. There are a lot of illiterate parents and youth who somehow we overlook that when we're talking about the at-risk problem, and it looks like it's focused in one group or one area.
Okay. Certainly our experience with the district is that it's rather evenly spread across the city. It seems to be more a function of social economic level than it is one of race. And anywhere we see the index of a neighborhood profile indicating the conditions of poverty are in place, we certainly are going to see a greater than normal number of students in the at-risk categories.
If I can address that briefly, the risk literature that I'm familiar with shows that race is not a predictor of mental illness, criminality, or anything else. Race is not a predictor. Okay? Middle-class black kids are no more at risk than middle-class white kids. The fact of the matter is, however, that black kids are disproportionately represented among the group in poverty. They are disproportionately represented, therefore, in the number of risk factors. if you look at it objectively, if you just stand back and look at objectively at risk factors and population demographics here in Portland, in this city area, I think you'd have to be very concerned about geographic areas that are high in poverty. I don't think it's an issue of race at all. I think it's an issue principally one of poverty.
Chip Greening, City Club member. My question is directed at Ms. Boozer. You have suggested that business become more involved in the school system. Recently, it has been reported that the Boston Business Group, which contracted with schools in Boston to increase the amount of resources at the school's disposal, pour more money into the school system in return for specific deliverables by the school in terms of improved student performance. It's reported that the business group kept up its end of the bargain. The school failed to deliver the improved performance. And now many business groups who have adopted schools or otherwise tried to improve performance in schools by giving them resources are rethinking that the donation of help. What specifically do you think that business groups should do that can have some success in improving performance at schools, specifically in the Portland schools?
Okay, I think we have some excellent models in Portland. We have the Private Industry Council that is deeply involved, the business community in partnership with the school district, whereby most of the programs operate with kids at the high school level, whereby businesses come in and help us to set up work experience stations for kids so that they can have the continuation of the academic program and also have an introduction to the world at work. And we've seen some of our most remarkable success stories in that way. And I think it is such partnerships where there is really the involvement of the business community in the planning process and agreeing on the delivery of services and also the evaluation process in lieu of just sort of throwing some resources out there and saying, here, you guys do it. The conditions that have created the at-risk kids are not going to be removed overnight. And I think very often many of the programs are being evaluated and people are looking for results when they should barely be off the drawing boards. And I think in terms of the commitment, it has to be a long-term commitment.
Ray Polani, a member of the City Club. Our legislature has just finished voting on an over $60 million package of taxes, additional taxes for highways. Our country is the only one that uses motor vehicle taxes exclusively for highways. Almost every other country in the world uses them as excise taxes, revenue producing. Isn't it perhaps time that we should revisit our constitutional restriction? How do you feel?
In my opinion, we need to look at all kinds of alternatives. We are frustrated as Oregonians when we've looked at alternatives in the past and brought them before the legislature. I don't know how many attempts have been made to find a different tax base for education and for other matters. I applaud your idea as one of potentially many ideas that we need to be looking at for a creative alternative to find a funding base.
Yes, sir.
Okay, I'm Bill Hale. I'm a member of the City Club. I also happen to serve as a board member on the Morrison Center board, so I have firsthand experience in watching Dr. Bolstad and his staff in action in dealing with the problems that are being outlined today, and I know how effective they have been in pursuing their goals. One of the major concerns that I have as a businessman, and I like the sound of if we invest $1 now, we're going to save $6 later, that I am concerned that these programs be expanded, because even though the work that the Morrison Center and other agencies similar to the center is doing is being very effective, it's not being effective enough in the sense of being able to serve all the needs of our community and certainly our state. Governor Goldschmidt appealed to me early on with his talk about a children's agenda. And Mrs. Boozer, I liked your term, children's crusade, because lately I haven't heard too much about the children's agenda, and I wasn't sure what the status of Oregon is in providing the necessary funding to expand these programs. What is being done?
The Children's Agenda initially called for $29 million as new dollars for child and family type programs. The political process got very complex. I can't tell you how much of that actually ended up actually being funded. I know the Great Start was requesting $8 million, and I think it ended up with $5.5 million. Certainly, we didn't meet the goal of $29 million. I don't think we came anywhere close to that goal. But in my opinion, the $29 million was a very modest goal to begin with. I urge you to look at the state of Washington. $720 million is their goal. And I think that's the kind of goal that's necessary. I think we need to think bigger than an agenda. I think we need to think bigger than $29 million. Frankly, the problem is larger than that. Volunteers are wonderful. I'm all for volunteers. I didn't mean to sound cynical about volunteers earlier. My comment was intended to simply mean volunteers are not going to solve this problem. They're going to help. But we're going to need much more than volunteers.
And as an online person involved with young people, when the programs come down with inadequate funding, those of us on the line see, to think of it as a new way to cut up the same old pie, but they haven't brought another pie into the picture. And that's what we need desperately.
I have a question which I think you've given some answers, but perhaps you'd like to summarize, and that is, what specific actions do you think are required by each of us as individuals to make the goals that you've outlined become the reality of the future?
I think certainly picking up on Orin's suggestion that we have to be willing to advocate for children. And that involves informing yourselves, as you're going to do over the next few weeks here, picking up other information. In addition to become an advocate, become an active supporter, being present. Somehow, if it's only you can do a couple of hours in one of the programs, and there are many of them around town, small programs that are beginning to do heroic work. I think, illustration, there are a group of women in North Portland called the Christian Women Against Crime. And they run a school suspension center. Young people who are out of school on suspension can elect in this particular neighborhood, the King neighborhood, to go to the center and be supervised and continue their homework. It's much more effective, a much better strategy. They are in critical need of volunteers, along with the financial support. And of course, that's always welcomed by the programs that are struggling. But suspension was a tool that was developed at a time when there were intact families to supervise the youngsters while they were out of school. I don't believe that's been an accurate kind of assumption to make about America for about 30 years. So I think if we advocate, if we support, and we are present to people.
I would just reiterate, I think we need to love our neighbor as ourselves. And we need to expand our definition of who our neighbor is. There are many programs. You could go through the Volunteer Bureau. There are many places that you could intervene and act individually. I have a lot of favorites. I'm intrigued with the Saturday program in Northeast Portland. I understand they have over 100 volunteers who come in out on Saturdays and tutor kids in helping them to learn how to read. And I think it's changed the attitude of a lot of those kids on Saturdays about going back to school on Monday. I think that's an excellent kind of thing to do. But I'd urge you especially to get involved in the political process. You know, children don't vote. And I think ultimately that's one of the reasons why children always come up with, short. Children don't vote. We need to be voting for children. We need to truly be stewards of the child.
We have time for one more question here. Since family dysfunction is a multi-generational issue, what do you think should be done in this area for healing of the children and also the family?
I'd love to answer that question, and I would encourage you to pick up the copy of the 2,500 family study that I have in the back for you. The main finding in that study of 2,500 families is we began that research kind of looking at children and trying to understand children. Fortunately, we collected a lot of data on their parents. What came out of that study basically is it's not the child that we need to be looking at, really. It's the parents. It's the parent variables that really predicted things like outcome, how these children would turn out. If you look at the risk factors that I didn't have time to really detail for you today, you'll find that the risk factors are not factors at all about children. They're factors that describe parents. So I think that we need to be looking at families, we need to be looking at parents, and I'm here to tell you, parents need support. Can you imagine, and maybe some of you here are, can you imagine being a single parent today? Working long hours, coming home at night, being exhausted. You got 3 kids who probably haven't been well supervised during the day after the school hours. I think that is an overwhelming experience. I'm thankful every day I'm not in that predicament. But we have people who are trying to survive in poverty, who are working, coming home to a situation where they haven't had the finances to take care of their children because we have inadequate daycare. It's a tough road. And I think we need to be very sensitive to those kinds of issues, not so much that we're critical of these parents, but we need to realize that these parents need support. They need help. They need assistance.
And one of the most effective programs I know about operating in the city is out in North and Northeast Portland. It's called Think and Try and Tender Loving Care. And their basic philosophical approach is we parent the parents. And the young people who have been involved in that program, who started with them at the 6th grade, are now, they've ended their sophomore year and are going into their junior year, and they're all still in school via that vehicle of parenting the parent.
I hope you all will join me in sincere thanks to Dr. Bolstad and Ms. Boozer for an excellent presentation, and will take heart their suggestions of how we can get involved. We are adjourned.